and this is Changing the Narrative. I'm your host, David Rives, and today we are changing the narrative when it comes to paleontology and dinosaurs. We've been spoon-fed a narrative of naturalism, a narrative of atheism, a narrative that tells you that you're star stuff. But what I want you to know is that you are fearfully and wonderfully made. You are created in the image of a loving God who cares about us. He cares about you so much that He literally came to this earth to live, die, be raised again so that we could be a part of His family for eternity. Yes, the gospel message itself. So it's time to change the narrative back to truth, and I have with me today Tommy Lohman. Tommy, welcome to the program.
Good to be here. Thank you.
It is great to have you in studio talking about dinosaurs, because you have dug up, as a paleontologist, many different creatures over the year. And I want you to share just a little bit about what you do, your ministry, and the way you tie in such a fascinating topic back to biblical truth.
Well, what I do is I'm the field paleontologist, and we take people out on digs to excavate fossils, skeletons, and in that we remind people that those fossils are in the ground as a result of water moving sediment.
Yeah.
Now, when you begin to back out and understand that this is a feature that happens all over the planet, you recognize you're seeing evidence for the Genesis flood. It's interesting, every once in a while people will give me that, so Tommy, how old do you think these fossils are? And I tie everything back to the Genesis flood, because in that they're kind of trying, are you 66 million years or are you 4,400 years? And as a young Earth creationist who believes the Bible's history is true, so we have that framework that we put in place for people. And that helps kind of lay the foundation for what we do through the course of the day or over several days together with our guests.
That is so neat, because literally here in Tennessee, we're seeing coal deposits, we're seeing crinoids and underwater sea creatures that were buried in rapid mud flows underwater, right? You move a little bit west and you start finding all of these other types of sea creatures and remains. You move, let's just go out to Kansas for a second, and you're finding mosasaurs and tylosaurs. You know, I lead a paleontological dig out in Kansas where you find massive clams and turtles and squids, right? Well, those things must have been buried in water, but underneath sediment, right? Because those are all water creatures. You move out to Texas and you're finding, mummified eriops, these amphibious creatures that are like gigantic salamanders. You move out to Colorado and you're finding these sauropod dinosaurs. You move out to Montana and you're finding these T-Rexes and these duck-billed dinosaurs. But the one thing that remains consistent is all over the world, there are deposits that have all of these creatures trapped in stone. That stone used to be mud, didn't it?
And that's an interesting thing, is you do see that. Is I point out to people, I said, you'll see the stratified layers. And I say, that only happens as a result of water. Right. And you begin to recognize as these layers stack on top of each other, and you see this clear evidence of vast volumes of water, not only moving sediment in, but eroding it out. Every once in a while we'll get, so why are we here in eastern Montana digging up dinosaur fossils?
Okay.
Why are they here? And, the most intuitive answer, I think, is, well, they died here. Or maybe rephrase, they lived here, but really they only died here.
Right.
And what we're seeing is multiple layers of sediment, hundreds and hundreds of feet and even thousands of feet of sediment. And we're finding fossils because they're uniquely exposed here.
Okay.
See, I think there are fossils that are much more extensive under the ground than what we even comprehend.
Yes.
There's more that's captured.
Millions of fossils underground that no one knows about.
No.
It's just in places like far west Kansas, in places like the Hell Creek Formation, in places like the Morrison Formation, it's basically erosion, probably late post-flood erosion or after the flood, cut through the strata where certain types of creatures had lived and died, right? And we just get this snapshot of those areas, right? But what would happen if we were to drill 100 feet down? We would probably hit another great deposit of dinosaurs. What about another 100 feet down? Another great deposit of fossils. In other words, we're literally sitting on a bone bed that is so extensive of millions and billions of fossilized creatures that it points back to catastrophic events. But this bone bed of fossils, which includes, we've talked before about bite marks that you find on some of your fossils that you've dug up, right? Sometimes you find cancers and diseases that the creatures had. Sometimes you find all of these little clues as to how they lived and died. That's a lot of death when you look at the skeletons of these fossils. How does the presence of so much death and disease, how does it fit in with the biblical narrative? What does it tell us?
Well, that's an interesting thing because a lot of people through the years have said, okay, the earth is clearly millions and billions of years old. So where do we put that time biblically? And so it winds up in Genesis chapter 1. There are various theories that we could talk about. But you pack that fossil record, what you're doing is putting a fossil record into Genesis chapter 1. But Genesis chapter 1 is describing a series of events over days of which creation came to be. And it wasn't until we get into the post-creation time where we get into Genesis 3 with the temptation of Eve, the fall of mankind. We see death being introduced, and eventually we see a flood. So what happens is we wind up taking sin and death and introducing it into Genesis chapter 1. We take, as you're talking about, cancer, predation, scavenging. We put it back into Genesis chapter 1. And now we've got the conclusion of Genesis chapter 1 where God says everything is very good.
Whoa, that
but the implication, no, it doesn't make sense. In fact, you can't have that. And so theologically, to put a fossil record into Genesis chapter 1 actually does damage to God's character and his nature. Not to mention it contradicts clear evidence. That the reason that we see predation, scavenging, death, all of these animals destroyed, thorns in the fossil record, all of this is a result of God judging the sin of humanity, not some random events as God's trying to figure things out in chapter 1.
Right. So it fits much more clearly after the fall, after sinners. Okay. And ultimately, most of the fossil record probably would come to that Genesis 6 sort of deluge. And
you see that you get into Genesis chapter 7:11. It says, the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of heaven were opened. And the balance of that chapter says, it keeps repeating this concept of the land was overtaken, the ground was overwhelmed, the high mountains were eventually covered. And you see this progression of a deluge. The earth is really just being utterly destroyed,
obliterated and reshaped,
literally. And so you move into chapter 8, which is what's the beautiful side of this. I think it is verse 1. It says, and God remembered Noah. And in that you see the waters, all of that activity is shut off. And the earth begins to kind of recover to some degree. And verse 5 says, and then Noah saw the mountains begin to basically peek out of the waters. Now, geologically, you begin to recognize some really cool things are happening with that.
And even theologically, when you look at that account, I always love the whole idea that Noah found grace. There's grace in the Old Testament right there. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And yet he also obeyed. He was like, I'm going to obey the Lord's instructions to build a boat, right? Even though everyone is making fun of me, even though everybody around me is saying, what are you doing, right? He told me to build a boat, so I'm going to build this boat. I'm going to honor him for that. And so because of his obedience, not just him, but his whole family, and ultimately life as we know it was saved. And I think that a lot of times we tend to take the Old Testament and we're like, well, we don't need that. Those are more allegories. Those are, we can learn from those things, but we don't. No, we're talking about historical events that are incredibly important for our spiritual growth, aren't they?
Well, you think about how many times the New Testament writers reference back to, in general, Genesis 1 through 11, but specifically the flood and the fall. They're building their theological arguments of who Jesus is, what he came to do, the implications of the church and its foundation, its formation, and how it grew. They're tying that and anchoring it back to Genesis 1 through 11. And Paul is really great with this in 1 Corinthians 15, where he talks about the first Adam fell in sin, and Jesus becomes the last Adam and basically restores and establishes something that Adam obviously did not. Those are not random kind of spiritual concepts, but they're rooted in literal historic events. And we've got to see the text that way from start to finish. We've got to read the scripture right, or we're not going to understand, one, the text itself, or really the full character and nature of God, or the work of Jesus Christ as a Savior and a Redeemer of the church.
Oh, that's incredible. Tell me a little bit about the museum, the Glendive Fossil Museum. I want to take me through what would we see when we step in the door? What is our experience going to be like?
Let me just anchor this with this concept. Otis and Miriam Klein, who's the founder of the museum, they sold a business. They were doing very well with their business in western Montana. And Otis was led by the Lord to basically sell that, move to eastern Montana, Glendive, and establish this museum and a dig site. And with that, the Lord blessed, and still to this day does. The museum opened in 2009. It was a lot of volunteer work that was done. And what you have when you open the door and come into the front is you see a science museum, you see a historic museum, but you see everything rooted in a biblical worldview. And so as you come in the front door and you're seeing dinosaur stuff, models, casts, real bone, you're beginning to see something unfold before your eyes. We had a guy come through this past summer was telling us that he said, I've never seen this argument before. We get this frequently, where they've grown up in a secular concept, deep time, evolution, millions of years, dinosaurs, man separated, and to walk through the museum and like, oh, this makes sense. I understand that. And what a beautiful testimony and an opportunity that there is for that.
Absolutely.
And so the museum is there to really press that argument forth. It's really to change people's narratives, if you will.
Absolutely.
I've had many conversations myself with people, and you recognize they struggle with that. It's like the Bible can't be true because the Bible argues for a literal 6 days. And this flood thing, is that really real? And where do I put dinosaurs in all of this? And so the museum is geared to help unpack some of that and to help orient people's thinking in that process.
That's neat. That's what an incredible mission.
Yeah.
When we go out in the field, let's just sort of picture ourselves out in the field. We have found an area of interest. Let's just say it's a fair-sized bone, right? Walk me through the steps, because you don't usually simply just try to chisel out the bone and rip it out. You're gonna take matrix out with it.
Rip it out. I love that wording. I would say, David, stop.
Right. This is a common misconception, right? That you have to sort of train people on their first dinosaur dig.
Yeah.
To explain the process.
It's interesting. We've had 3 or 4 people this summer said, is it always bringing first-timers up here? I said, yeah. We're always going through that same argument. And I remind them, particularly if you've got little boys, I said, look, you're in the ground with a bunch of dirt, and you would think you couldn't do damage to things. And yet there's an amazing amount of finesse that goes into this process. And so as you're working to discover this bone, you're beginning to, as you're talking about with the matrix, the sediment that surrounds the bone, to work that back. Okay. It's a slow process because you assume that they're broken, fractured, or you're going to break them in the process. Yeah. And so we're managing that. We don't stress about that, but there's a process we go through. We use glues to help kind of hold certain things together. We have what we call a field prep. Once we begin to get the bone exposed, we're taking the top, the sides, taking it down. We create a little pedestal, like to kind of visualize with a mushroom as you're trying to get a little bit of dirt underneath. If the bone requires it, we'll put what we call a field jacket on it, which you start with just a layer of aluminum foil. And then we've got burlap bags and plaster, and we create a cast around it. Procedures we're doing probably are 150 years old. Yeah. You know, it's not a new developing process. It's just get in and do hard work. Yeah. And then once that sets up, you roll it over and carry it back to the lab.
So the field jacket is almost like setting a bone. It is, you're basically working with broken bones. Yeah. And it's incredible how similar the process is. You're working with plaster of Paris. You're working with burlaps basically to create a hardened cast around the bone. The difference is, a lot of times you're trying to make sure that there is some material around that as well to create a cushion. And then once you get that, once it's hardened, once everything's set up, then you're basically breaking this bone off of the rock on that little tiny stem of the mushroom. Is that correct? Yes.
We have a lot of softer sediment, looser sediment, so that sometimes isn't a problem. But it can be more of a problem. You get down into Colorado and you're going to get bones that are in rock, and therefore you're going to need to be more attentive to how you do that. And then when you get it back to the lab, you begin the process of trying to get that bone out of the jacket, get the sediment, the matrix off the bone. And we're using microjacks, micron blasters, dental picks, brushes, things of that nature. And it's a slow process.
Yeah, everybody likes to find the bones, but it's what happens afterwards.
We've incorporated lab time into our excavation, so ideally what we do is we have somebody dig in the morning, give them a lunch break, and then we come back in the afternoon with lab.
Great.
And what that does is that gives somebody, let's say they've got a basic bone that we would send home with them. We don't just send them a broken bone that's covered with dirt, but if they have lab time, they can come in and learn the techniques of cleaning, of gluing. And so they were the ones that maybe discovered it, excavated it in the afternoon, prepped it to take home with them.
Wow.
And so it really, I think, enhances when you begin to understand that what you're doing is you're taking it from the field to ultimately a museum display level.
Yeah. Yeah. It's got to be cleaned. It's got to be prepped. It's got to be carefully preserved. Okay. So do you typically find, because this is a question that a lot of children have, do you typically find the whole dinosaur?
I tell people, I said, you're not digging on a skeleton today.
Or do you typically find disarticulated pieces?
It's disarticulated pieces. Okay. It's just, you're reminded of the nature of the ground and its movement, even secondary deposits. Yeah. You see them broken apart more and more. And so it's heads, feet, tips of tails will typically get disconnected from the mass of the body. Okay. So sometimes you'll find foot bones but no body. Sometimes you'll find a body with no feet, as an example. So
that's incredible. That's incredible. What's the age range that you would say typically goes on a dig?
We would probably be 12 to 60 is probably a good age range. Okay. There are some kids that are younger that could do well with it. And I just ask parents, just be honest with what your child, because it requires attention to detail, a careful, steady hand. We have some kids that can be 6 years old and be great with it.
I was just about to say, I've had 6-year-olds who were very meticulous, very careful, who did better than some 12-year-olds.
Oh yeah, and we've had 12-year-olds that were done 30 minutes in.
Exactly. So it kind of depends on it, but everybody thinks that it sounds glamorous. It's a lot of hard work.
Yes, it is.
It's very educational.
It's you get in there and it remind people you're on the ground in the dirt, pushing with tools, hammers. It is work. It is rewarding work,
yes.
particularly if you get to find that thing. And you get in there and you get to work on it and you get the reward of excavation.
Absolutely.
The effort's worthwhile.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about the museum and Otis a little bit more. Did he collect most of the things in the museum prior, or was this put together in 2009, you said?
2009, yes, sir.
From scratch? I mean, did he literally have to start building this up?
Yeah, pretty much from scratch.
Really?
Yeah. We've got casts, which was part of what, the skeletons casts, that was part of getting started.
Yeah.
But he didn't have a pre-existing fossil collection.
Wow.
Now, he had already been digging some, so there were a few things that
Sure.
came in. And that's really been my heartbeat over these years that I've been there, is to enhance and build the bones.
Yes.
To extend the collection. And with this skeleton, we're hoping that one day we may get to stand it up, which is going to be fascinating. So, you've got 65% of a skeleton, prep the bones, and then create the ironwork to stand that thing up.
Yeah.
And so the Lord's blessed us in these ways.
Absolutely. The neat thing in paleontology that it started several years ago, but all of a sudden it has taken the paleontological world by storm, or maybe, pun intended, it's rocked the paleontological world, is the existence of original biomolecules in soft tissue.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Talk about it for a second.
I think it's one of the most incredible observations, insights, and discoveries that in paleontology, potentially ever, because the implications are really reshaping the entire narrative of how we see dinosaurs. And of course, go back to Dr. Mary Schweitzer back, 20 plus years ago, and dissolving the bone away and finding stretchy blood vessels, red blood cells.
Yeah.
And that continues to be a thing that is prevalent. This Edmontosaurus that we dug up, 65%, we were able to send off some samples down to Brian Thomas.
Yes.
Down at ICR. I think you've had him here.
Absolutely.
And he's beginning to look and try to identify as conclusively as possible if there's collagen in these bones. Now, these are proteins, blood vessels, collagen, so on and so forth. These are decaying elements within the bones themselves.
Yeah.
Now, that idea of decaying is important because when an animal is alive, those materials are functioning as tissue.
Sure.
And once that animal dies, there's a life in which that will exist till it's eventually decayed completely.
Okay.
Now, they can argue what that time frame might be. I hear 50,000, 100,000, even a million years is for some materials.
But that does nothing for the secular idea that almost everything that you're digging up is at least 60 million years old.
Yes. And I would, it's not that I would argue for a million years, but it's like the implications, but there's no way it can be 65 million years. It's just impossible.
Right.
And so you begin to recognize that the narrative that we have had before us, I go all the way back to when I was in school as a little boy, and I see some of the stuff I had. It just cannot be, which is reshaping how we understand them.
Right.
But what that's doing is not just reshaping so that we can see paleontology differently, but it's creating an authenticity of Genesis chapter 1 as creation over 6 literal days and the flood as a real event. And those are profound implications.
It absolutely is.
So it has both a scientific incredible nature to it, but it also has theological implications.
Yeah, it's so exciting, and the very fact that some things are being found in almost a partially mummified condition, that sometimes there are skin impressions left, but sometimes there are legitimately osteocytes, proteins, collagens, things that simply shouldn't exist given what we've been told about dinosaurs, but given a biblical interpretation, it makes perfect sense that if these creatures were rapidly buried in muddy layers when the fountains of the great deep broke open and the windows of heaven were open. Tremendous amounts of mud, sand, silts, and sediment started to wash across the continents in tsunami-like waves, burying these creatures very rapidly, so rapidly that it started a preservation process, and in some cases began to fossilize the exterior of the bones, but not completely all the way to the interior, still leaving tiny remnants of these original biomolecules that speaks, like you said, Tommy, to the authenticity of God's word from the very beginning. And then when you realize, well, from the very beginning, I can trust it. It's scientifically correct. It's historically correct. It's prophetically correct. Well, what about at the very end? Yeah, absolutely. If you can trust it at the very beginning, then you can absolutely trust it to the very end, which tells us of a future that is incredibly bright for those of us who have put our faith in Jesus.
Yes, yes. And there's a hope in that, which is so much of what 2 Peter 3, which he was pressing his readers to, is the hope found in Christ because of the anticipated return of Jesus Christ.
Wow. Incredible, incredible. How can we find out more about you, your ministry, and the things that you're doing?
Well, the easiest thing is to go to creationtruth.org and just visit there. You can contact me through that website, and also just kind of look at schedule of future digs if you're ever interested. Nothing else, come up and see us in Glendive, Montana, and visit the museum. I think you'll be blessed and encouraged.
Absolutely. creationtruth.org. Make sure that you are subscribed to this podcast, because we are going to actually have Tommy on multiple podcasts here. We are doing filming that will soon be released for Wonders Without Number, as well as live presentations on Genesis Science Network as well. I'm David Rives, and until next time on Changing the Narrative, I want you to keep looking up. Truly, the heavens declare the glory of God. Find us on all social platforms to stay informed. Watch Genesis Science Network 24/7 for free on Roku, Fire TV, and on our website. Visit the world's largest origins-based store, creationsuperstore.com. Plan your trip to the Wonders Center and Science Museum just outside of Nashville, Tennessee. Donate to our nonprofit ministry to help us continue sharing truth.